So our next speaker is E. Ray Moore, Jr. He's a Bible teacher, Army Reserve chaplain, retired, and campaign consultant. He served 28 years in pastoral ministry as a campus pastor, pastor-teacher at the local church, or as an Army chaplain. He has served as a speaker or lecturer in a university setting on public policy, church, state, and theological issues. He has worked as a campus pastor at both the University of South Carolina and Purdue. He's consulted and worked with a number of different campaigns, but he asked me not to mention that, so we'll pass up on that part of it. But he and his wife, Gail, have written a devotional book called The Promise of Jonadab, Building a Christian Family Legacy in a Time of Cultural Decline, and I personally can endorse that. It's a wonderful little devotional book. I would encourage you to get it. He is a South Carolina native and a graduate of the Citadel with a BA in Political Science. He received his Master of Divinities in 1974 and his THM in 1979 from Grace Theological Seminary. He served over 30 years as a campus pastor, and for his service in the Gulf War I, Chaplain Moore was awarded the Bronze Star. He currently serves as president of Frontline Ministries, Inc., and the Exodus Mandate Project, which focuses on prayer, revival, and K-12 Christian education and homeschooling. Ray and his wife, Gail, were honored as South Carolina Parents of the Year in 2000, and they have 4 children. I think I did not mention that, but anyway, he has another project that he's working on, IndoctriNation, and he's going to introduce that. And I have seen the movie and would highly recommend that as well. It does a great job of exposing what goes on in our government schools, but I'm not going to say anything more about that because that's his topic. So let's welcome Ray Moore.
Just a few housekeeping items. I've got a gift for Jim. It's a DVD with Judy Rogers, a Christian singer, and she wrote a song to honor Judge Roy Moore called Here I Stand, and it's on this particular CD, Christian music, ballads, folk music. She's really one of the great Christian singers in the country today, and it was first performed at our banquet in 2003, about 2 months before he was removed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But I'm giving this to Jim as a gift from our ministry, and I'm happy to report he has been renominated. Some of you might not know that. He won the Republican primary for Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Alabama just a few months ago. Surprised everybody because he won 50.5% in a 3-way race, so there won't be a runoff, and he has to face a Democrat in the fall. And he's a Republican, but he's one of the good Republicans.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay. Ready with the next slide. I am E. Ray Moore, and I'm the founder and president of the Exodus Mandate Project and Frontline Ministries. And as Jim said, we concentrate on advancing K-12 Christian education and homeschooling with a focus on prayer and revival. The purpose of the Exodus Mandate Project, okay, this is our vision statement. Everything we've done really in the last 15 years flows out of this statement. We encourage Christians and churches and pastors to leave behind the Pharaoh school system, or the state-run public school system, as we sometimes say, for the promised land of Christian schools and homeschooling. Additionally, it's our prayer and hope that a fresh obedience by Christian families and educating their children according to biblical mandates will be a key for the renewal of our families, our churches, and our nation. And a little personal history. My wife and I have 4 adult children. We've been married 42 years. I may look 58, but I really am 68. But we've been married 42 years, have 4 adult children and 7 grandchildren. We, in the good grace of our Lord, we started off homeschooling in 1977 with our oldest son. It was just about me and my kids at that particular time. But over the next 20 years, I believe God showed me that this is a comprehensive vision and strategy for renewal of our families, our churches, and our culture. So in 1997, I stepped up and offered a project called the Exodus Mandate Project. Frankly, it was pretty rough going in the first few years. We languished, didn't get much attention. We had a lot of opposition, even from my fellow pastors. But in the last 8 or 10 years, we've started to get some serious traction and movement in this area. And I'm happy to report homeschooling is growing at a rate of about 3 to 7% a year. We need to pray for our private and Christian schools, however. There's been a little lapse there because of the terrible financial conditions that we face in our country, and some are giving it up and going back into public schooling, and we're working hard to try to correct that. Some are giving up K-12 Christian day schooling and going into homeschooling. But we started this project in 1997. And we are best known we're the ministry of the organization that's pushing K-12 Christian education and homeschooling in the Southern Baptist Convention. There have been some real vigorous debates and at the national annual meeting. If any of you are Southern Baptists, you might be familiar with that. It has made international news starting in 2004. We put a resolution before the national annual meeting, and it failed the first year, but it created this huge debate, and it was a national news story. For the first 2 months after we put the resolution in, I just sat at my desk and did radio interviews and newspaper interviews all over the country. It was such a big story that a lot of people thought it passed. My good friend, former Attorney General Mark Earley of Virginia, who went to work with Chuck Colson's Prison Fellowship Ministry, reported that he was meeting with Chuck Colson one day, and he thought it had passed. There was so much publicity about it, and he said, I was sad to have to tell him that the resolution didn't pass. But it was so much publicity and debate about it that it was one of the most glorious defeats I'd ever seen. So we were happy either way because of the publicity. Well, the good news now is that we've got a new tool, a new weapon in the arsenal that can help advance and grow K-12 Christian schooling and homeschooling. And it's called IndoctriNation. And it's been out 6 months, and we've sold over 18,000 copies in 6 months. We've had lots of groups coming in and helping with it. It's not just our ministry. We're a little too small to be able to push it and promote it well by ourselves. But Vision Forum, which is headed up by Doug Phillips, American Vision, Gary DeMar, Answers in Genesis with Ken Ham, some large Bible-based Christian ministries are promoting this movie, and they're selling them by the thousands. And people are taking it and using it as a tool. Also, just recently in February, our movie took first place in the documentary category of the San Antonio Independent Christian Film Festival, which has turned out to be quite a nice event in the last 10 years. That was also headed up by Doug Phillips. And we were first runner-up in the overall category to the very popular, outstanding Christian movie called Courageous, done by the Kendrick brothers. It's one of the few Christian movies, explicitly Christian movies, it makes it into the theaters, and we were runner-up to them. And this is one of the good times that being second might be good, because every time people discuss Courageous in the news media and reports, they say, and first runner-up was the movie IndoctriNation. And what is that about, after all? And so they look into our movie, and we get additional publicity. So right now, I'm going to show you a 3-minute trailer on the movie. It's just a sample of it. It's about 100 minutes. It's a little long, but it does hold your attention. And I'm presenting this as a weapon, a tool that you might be able to use to help your own agenda, because all politics is always informed by culture and some sort of moral sentiment. So let's go with the trailer.
I want to see a child in every public school in America who is trained as a witness for Jesus Christ.
When you send that child off to school today, you're sending them into a pagan society.
And the studies are showing that there's virtually no discernible difference between the church and the world. At what point is Southern Baptists going to rise up and say, enough is enough?
Whatever we once were, we are no longer a Christian nation.
We've got to do something different. The schools are failing.
And I would go to 6 or 7 days a week, not just Monday through Friday.
That's what you're sending your child into. And you cannot deny that.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! No justice!
They are stealing our children. But because they are leaving the body of the child with us, we don't even know what's happening.
The public schools by law have been prohibited from teaching anything which is called sectarian. And sectarian means Bible-believing Christianity.
This is especially important for Christian families because the government schools are not going to say anything about God, even though Christians believe that fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Traveling in a school bus and interviewing historians, educators, theologians, and everyday Americans, Colin Gunn is on a quest to discover the origins of our modern educational system.
Boston became an experimental city, and Horace Mann and others were pushing for a government-controlled education curriculum.
Horace Mann, like many of the grandchildren of these wonderful Christian pastors, was a man who rejected the Trinity. He rejected the authority of Scripture. In other words, he rejected the very thing that teaches a sound philosophy of education, the Word of God.
Jesus said, build your house upon the rock. But the foolish man refused the words of Christ, would not build their education systems on the fear of God, on the words of Christ.
If we want to see lasting cultural renewal, what we have to see is a decrease in the number of students who are being indoctrinated by our Marxist educational system.
All right, thank you. If you get a copy, you can see the rest of it. This is just a little trailer. And I'm going to take a few minutes now and go through some of the broader themes and the reason why this is an important tool for all Christians and conservatives to win the cultural, spiritual, and even the political war for the soul of our nation. Okay, ready for the next one? We've had 8 or 10 major court cases that will make it impossible to ever bring back religion or Christianity, Bible and prayer to public schools. I get fundraising letters from different people saying, you know, elect me and we'll bring prayer and Bible reading back into public schools. It's the most absurd argument. We have so many cases now. This is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. These are the example of some of the cases that have gone on since 1947, starting with Everson versus Board of Education. That was the first case, Supreme Court case, which the separation of church and state argument, now used by the left to literally put us into Christian people in sort of a ghetto type situation, was ever used, and it was just cut out of with no precedent at all. So we have these other cases. I won't go into them, but these are examples of the cases that have really expelled Christianity by practice and precept from state-run public education or government schools. That's why we call them Pharaoh schools. But you can teach homosexuality in these schools today. You can teach Islamic faith. You certainly can teach a secular faith. You can teach evolution. That's all allowed by law. And so what has this produced in our children? What does this produce? Next slide, go ahead. An allied group that we work very closely with called the Nehemiah Institute, they do peers testing or Christian worldview testing on Christian children in 3 categories: public education, homeschooling, and Christian schooling. And it's a worldview assessment program. Next slide. And they test these areas. This is not a theology test. This is what we call a Christian worldview as it relates to politics, economics, education, religion, and social issues. And this would be how, when you look at a worldview, how does theology or how does God relate to man and the world? And so this is what this test, it evaluates their understanding in these key areas, and they're applicable to all societies. And here's the next one, shows the categories. Biblical theism, of course, is the ideal. A 70 is a really good score. And normally if you're in school today and you make a 70, you're just barely passing. But in this worldview test, even a moderate Christian score is not too bad, according to my friend Dan Smithwick. Next slide. Now you can see here what's going on in public, Christian, and homeschooling. And this test has about 80 questions, and it asks in these areas that we looked at: politics, economics, education, religion, social issues. Right now, about 80% plus of Christian children from dedicated Christian families, what we sometimes might even refer to them as evangelical Christians, or the Christian right, broadly speaking. 80% of children from these types of families that are staying in the public school system through their career are testing Marxist socialists on a Christian worldview. They may be Christians, but they do not think like a Christian in any of these areas. And this is why we're seeing now polling that shows that the majority of our youth, say the millennials, those younger than 30, a lot of us here are much older, they favor same-sex marriage and homosexuality as being legal in society. It's because of the public school system. Sadly, some of our Christian schools are also dropping because they use secular curriculum. They kind of sanitize the environment, but they don't really teach the children thoroughly in a comprehensive Christian worldview. He's tested over 35,000 to 40,000 children. It's a pretty good sample. The homeschoolers and those who are in classical Christian schools, or the principal approach Christian school, are steady in about the 50%, and some even above 70%. Remember, I said a 70% is not a bad score, even though we would hope to do better. I took the test, and I made about an 88%. I was really shocked that I just did that poorly. I thought I would have done much better. But it does show in the area of social issues that sometimes we have people of goodwill have differing views. Now, the case, next slide, that we make a biblical theological case for Christian education. We state that the scriptures explicitly state that it should be the norm of faith and practice for Christian families to give their children a Christian education. I do honestly believe, even though I don't say it every time I speak, that it's a sin to public school your kid. Now, why would that be? Well, first of all, it's a pagan, godless educational environment. And we as Christians are commanded, we're not allowed to put our children under false doctrine of any kind. And there's a belief by many Christians that the public school system is religiously neutral. No, it's not religiously neutral. It is explicitly anti-Christian. Well, I'm happy to see I've got some good agreement on that one, because I get hammered on that one more than anything else. I mean, I have friends that really get on to me because I say that. And I don't say it every time I open my mouth, but I think we need to get to the bottom line, and this is a faith and obedience issue of how you raise your children. Let's go through these slides pretty quickly. These are just some of the texts that we use. The people who differ with me, the biggest objection we get, first two. The first one is that my children are being salt and light and being missionaries in these public schools. So we have to hit that one head on. There's no text in the Bible that gives you permission to put your child in a godless, pagan, educational environment that's religiously hostile to their faith. They're being indoctrinated, and of course that's what our movie is about. So we do a lot of work among Southern Baptists. We're not a Southern Baptist ministry explicitly, even though we work a lot. And of course, you know, in the South there are more Baptists than there are people. They say in South Carolina, they say if you turn over a rock, you'll find a Baptist. So we have an unlimited pool there, but the Southern Baptist Convention is pretty strong in the upper Midwest too, and even there are 1,500 Southern Baptist churches in the state of California. That might shock you to know that. So it's really a national denomination, and we're working with all the Bible-based denominations. We've gotten some good response in the Presbyterian Church of America. We're getting good response now with the Assemblies of God and some of the independent Pentecostal and charismatic churches as well. But this is one of our main texts, and we tell Southern Baptists they're the Great Commission people. If you talk to a Southern Baptist, man, we are doing the Great Commission, which means you're to evangelize and disciple the nation. When I say, no, you're violating verse 20, teaching them. Jesus gave the education mandate not to the government, but to the family and the church, not the government. And this is where you have to drive a stake in the ground, and you have to really take your stand there. Another central text is Deuteronomy. It doesn't have it. Okay, it's not referenced. It's Deuteronomy 6, 4-7. And this is a central text for family-based education. And no wiggle room here about giving your children over to a pagan to educate them. And then, of course, Matthew 28. The next one is 37-40, and it says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. He cares about how we think and loving Him. Now, another argument that's made against state education is what we call the jurisdictional argument, and we'll go through these pretty quickly, too. There's 4 spheres of government: self-government, church government, civil government, and family government. And so Abraham Kuyper, the great Dutch theologian, around the first part of the 20th century, coined the term sphere sovereignty. Catholic theology has the comparable concept of subsidiarity, which means that God has ordained jurisdictions and of governments and things that will be carried out within those jurisdictions. We tried to set up something like that with our constitutional republic, where the separation of powers is supposed to, you have the executive and the legislative and the judicial branch. Now, of course, that's being violated constantly, and power is being taken away from the states, it's being taken away from the family. But this is a very important concept where you need to also drive another stake in the ground and make this case. So self-government is where you govern yourself. And these are the areas that we look at there. Your personal life, your moral personal life. All right, now the church government is the next one. And we see there the things that the churches are supposed to do. They're supposed to exercise some sort of discipline over their people: admonition, baptism, communion, public worship, preaching, teaching. Education has been given to the church. And that's not just preaching on Sunday. That's Monday. I would rather see Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday school as much as Sunday school. And Sunday school is not really a thorough Christian education. You can't overcome 30 hours of indoctrination in the public schools during the week and with 1 hour Sunday school on Sunday with your children, particularly when half of that is just entertainment and fun and games. Intercessory prayer, pastoral care, and finally the development of civil rulers. The churches should be instructing in Christian worldview and training people for public office, and we're not doing that either very well. The next one is the duties of civil government. One of the big problems we have today in the Christian right and the conservative movement is I call the abuse of the Romans 13 teaching. I was in a church about 6 years ago and frankly withdrew my membership and changed to another church. I heard the preacher, and he's a good man, just ignorant. And he got up and preached a sermon on Romans 13, and when he got through, he didn't say this in the sermon. I said, look, what I heard you say this morning, based on this almost a divine right of kings, I mean, we've replaced it with, the government can do no wrong because they're ordained of God. I said, what I heard you here this morning, do you think if the government orders us to kill Jews, are we supposed to do that? Oh, no, you couldn't do that. And I said, well, that's what I heard you say this morning. Now, he didn't really say it but that was the implication of what he said. Reverend Chuck Baldwin, who's affiliated with the Constitution Party, has written a new book just called Romans 13. And I haven't read it yet. I'm getting ready to order it, but I've read excerpts and summaries of it. And he challenges this contemporary teaching that's very common in a lot of our churches today of Romans 13. The Romans 13 is proscriptive, not descriptive. And it basically puts limits on the government, and education is not in their category. You notice on my list, you don't see education there, do you? Well, it's not there. So we say that God gave the education of children to the family with assistance from the church. It's not the state. The government has no God-ordained right to be educating children. And we're concentrating our efforts in K through 12, but I do really believe the same holds for higher ed, but I can't take on too many more fights. I'm booked up on all my fights right now. Family government is next. And education of children falls under the family. My wife and I have written a little book. Maybe I can make a little commercial because I'm going to be addressing this topic tomorrow in the worship service. For those of you that don't leave tonight or tomorrow, we're going to have a little worship service at 10. And we've written a little book called The Promise of Jonadab. And the subtitle is Building a Christian Family Legacy in a Time of Cultural Decline. And so we talk here about how to raise Christian kids in these difficult days in which we live. Now, there's a real bad history here as well, and let's go to the next one. And these are some warnings from the past. A.A. Hodge was considered one of America's leading theologians around the end of the 19th century, and he made this statement: as public education as we know it today was becoming dominant in the culture. It was taking over and becoming really dominant. He made this statement, and I'm not going to read it, but it shows how prophetic he was, that the state-run public school system is the main enemy we have. It's really the cause of all the other problems that we're fighting. We're running around fighting against symptoms, but the root of it is indoctrination that's gone on for 6 generations with our children. So even our own children, if you public school them, don't think like you do. You're not going to even be able to pass your worldview and your faith onto your children if you leave them in public school. Next slide. John Stuart Mill was a great free market economist, and this is what he said. He wasn't totally against any sort of state education, but he acknowledged that a state education is not about education, but about molding people into thinking the way the government wants them. Next slide. R.L. Dabney was a great Southern theologian, probably the South's leading theologian after the Civil War, and he was also Stonewall Jackson's chief of staff during part of the time in the war. And he made this statement about the priority of educating children. And this is a great quote, one of my favorite. And it's the most important business done on earth. One thing that you're kept alive to do is to pass your faith and your worldview and your values to your children. C.S. Lewis. These are just famous people that we know about who've made some comments on this. And of course, there are whole books. I haven't mentioned R.J. Rushdoony, who wrote The Messianic Character of American Education. But that was a book that was very shaping in my thinking. And he wrote it in 1963, and he basically showed that the founders of public education were Unitarians and not Christians, and they set up education, public education, more or less, as a way to undermine Orthodox Christianity and undermine our constitutional Republican form of government. And the book came out in 1963, and it was virtually ignored in the evangelical and conservative Orthodox Christian community. Nobody reviewed it, nobody paid any attention to it, but it was viciously attacked by the left. They knew that it was a threat. The arguments were a threat to their monopoly that they now enjoy in K-12 education. But our poor pastors and theologians didn't think enough of it to even review it. So sometimes the enemy understands what you're doing better than your friends do. When I started my ministry in 1997, I felt called to do this. I was at a meeting in Washington, was put on by the conservative right, and they were decrying Goals 2000 and School to Work and some of these agendas. And I sat there all day listening to our best leaders, and I could name them and you would know them, and I still honor and revere a lot of them. Was all the conservative Christian right groups came together, and the main thing they would say is, "Oh, isn't it terrible? Somebody do something." And the only plan they had was to repeal bad laws. I mean, they didn't have a plan. And I sat there and said, wow, these are our leaders. These are our best people, and they don't even have a plan. They don't have a clue about what to do. So I felt God calling me, and I went out of there and I said, by God's grace, I'm going to extract several million children out of these schools in the next few years. And I felt pretty foolish thinking that, honestly. But I went around the country and I talked to some of my friends. I talked with my pastor friend Joe Moorcraft, who's on the movie there, and he's one of the great Presbyterian theologians in America. And he said, "Ray, you got to do it." And he said, "We're going to announce it in church Sunday." And I said, "Wait, I'm not ready yet. I'm still thinking about it." And so Sunday he had me stand. He said, "There's a guy here that's going to lead a crusade to get millions of kids out of public school." So I kind of stood up, kind of, looking around, because that was the first public announcement. If you know Joe, that's the way he does. So he kind of threw me out there before I was ready. But I met with my good friend Henry Hamilton. He's a lawyer in Columbia, and he was Michael New's lawyer in the court case, and he's a homeschooler and a retired Army colonel like me. And he said, "Ray, if you try to do that, you'll become the most hated man in America." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, the left will hate you because they will know you have figured out how they're winning. They will know, and they will really come after you." But he said the Christians will all hate you too because they don't want to obey God when it comes to educating their children. Well, thank the Lord, it hasn't worked out quite that way. I think I'm still below the radar with a lot of our enemies, and the Christians are sort of waking up slowly, but it's pretty slow. You got to really work with them to get them to do the right thing. Our next slide is a conversation that I had with the legendary Paul Weyrich, who's one of the great leaders of the conservative Christian movement, who's passed on to his reward now. And it was at a large gathering about 5 years ago of major conservative Christian leaders, and we were talking, and I do have two witnesses that he said this, because when I tell it to some of my want-to-fix-it public school reformers, who are very numerous in our camp, they kind of question it. But this is what he said to me. He said, "Christians and conservatives chose politics as the principal means to win the culture. The left has captured the media, the arts, the universities, and public schools and courts, all of our culture-shaping institutions, so that when conservatives win elections, the left still wins because they control the culture. Culture always trumps politics." That's an important thing to remember. It's really the seminal idea. And then he said, "You're doing the right thing by helping families and churches choose Christian or homeschooling. Culture trumps politics." And this is why you have to work on the culture even when you're working on your campaign. And I think the point I want to make this morning, I'm getting to it right now, is that sometimes a good campaign can drive the culture. We can drive the culture if you take the right issues. Let's take a minute and just review third-party politics or the political agenda, say the last couple of hundred years. Lincoln was elected in 1860 in a multi-party. I think there were 4 major candidates running, and he won with much less than 40% of the vote. But the issue that was driving the Republican Party at that time was the anti-slavery issue. And I don't want to get into all the rights and wrongs of all of that. I'm a Southerner, so I have a little bit of a Southern perspective on that era, and I don't think the South was necessarily fighting just to maintain slavery. But still, we look at this issue that was what drove the Northern Republicans at that time. In 1964, Barry Goldwater took a terrible beating, and we could say in some ways he was elected when Ronald Reagan won in 1980. McGovern took a terrible beating in 1972, but it drove this whole leftist, SDS, socialist movement into the heart of the Democratic Party, and they became even more leftist than they are today, and we saw Carter and Clinton coming to power, and contributed to by the McGovern election in 1972. The Ron Paul candidacy, which some here would probably be favorably inclined toward, has failed in 2008 and probably will fail in 2012. But it's one of the most exciting things to see. I went to the victory rally in South Carolina when we had our primary, and there was 400 or 500 people there, and 3/4 of them under 30 years old. 3/4 of them. So sometimes you can lose and still win. You have to have a multi-generational view. And so I think the Constitution Party and some of the other third parties have fought heroically, and you say, well, what's going to happen? Can we ever turn the corner? But you know, we do have tides, and things can happen in this area over time. Take a look at the next one. We've done some polling, but not recently. We do need funds for a major poll in this area, but there are groups that have done polling on the separation of school and state. My friend, the late Marshall Fritz, ran a poll in 1998 where he asked, it was a large poll. It was done by the Worthland groups. It was a very large poll, expensive, and they tested the question, are you in favor of doing away with state-sponsored public education? This was in 1998, 1999. And there have been others that have been run since, but not by any of our close allies. And 14% of all Americans at that time felt very strongly about jettisoning the state-run public school model. Just get rid of it. And 13% generally favored the idea. So it was about 27%. Then they asked a qualifying question, which basically is the thing that's the main argument that's holding up our movement. If the poor, this is a question, when you talk about getting rid or abolishing state education, they say, well, what about the poor? What are we going to do with the poor? And it's a good question. It's a legitimate question to ask. They asked that question, and they said, if you could be persuaded that the poor would have their needs met through private Christian and homeschooling and through charity, would you then be in favor? And it jumped to over 50%. Now, they say in polling, it's not, you can't take those two numbers and add them together and say that 50% support your idea. But we do believe today about 25% to a third of the public, Christian and non-Christian, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Gentile, even atheists, some atheists, in particular libertarian people, a lot of them, they're not certainly all atheists, but a lot of people in the libertarian movement are certainly in favor of this as well. So we think there's a strong case that could be made for the abolishing of the state-run school system. 1/3 of people are conservatives, and many of these are Christians, evangelical Christians, that are fighting to save the public school system. They want to reform it, but they're very unhappy with it. And then, and a lot of what we do and our purpose of our movie is to try to persuade them that they need to come over to the first position. And then 1/3 are the hard left deconstructionists, politically correct crowd, and the worse the public schools become and the more harmful they become, the better they like it. So we can't reach them unless they get converted, I guess, to God. I work very closely with another organization. I'm just going to take a little aside here on this, called Copperhead Consulting, run by Paul Dorr. And he basically goes around the country working with anti-tax groups on school bond referendum and levies. And he has been doing this for 10 years, and mostly in the upper Midwest, and they have won 80% of their contests, and some of them pretty decisively. And so what he does, he goes in, and when they have a school bond to raise taxes for more public school buildings, he goes in and they defeat them. We had one in South Carolina in May of 2010. It was pretty dramatic what happened. a lady who was a friend of mine was very agitated that they were going to put $350 million on local taxes and property taxes to build more public schools. And she prayed, and she went and took an ad out in the newspaper and said, "I am a Christian woman." That was the headline. "And I am very concerned about what they're doing. If you want to help fight this, meet me on the steps of the courthouse on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. And 100 people showed up, didn't even know who they were. And so we got a hold of Paul Dorr, and he was there, worked with him about 2 months. Nobody was against it except this one couple and a few friends. The mayor, the chairman of both parties, the Chamber of Commerce, the radio, TV, newspaper, anybody who was anybody in Aiken, South Carolina was in favor of this thing because it was for the children. And when the dust settled and the votes were cast, they defeated them 69 to 31%. It was breathtaking. And what I'm trying to tell you is that you can run against public education and actually win. And he's done it 80% of the time. And when he loses, it's very close. And they've beaten him in Omaha, in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So take note of that. And we have a lot of these materials on our table. And I'd like you at least to pick it up and get it in your file, because every city and town and county is having some kind of school bond levy. Okay, now let's take some of our final slides looking at the movie itself. We've already given you a little bit of report on it. It sold 18,000 copies in 6 months. We have them on our table in the back. And it's a well-done movie in terms of the actual quality of it. We've had Colin Gunn is an award-winning Christian movie producer, and his aide and helper was Joaquin Fernandez, who works with my ministry. And I'm the executive producer and the sponsor. So I had a secondary role, but we helped fund it. We put up about half the funds for it in our ministry and some of our friends, and then I kind of gave some general guidance. It is the message of Exodus mandate. Right now, we have a pool of between 2.5 million to 3 million homeschoolers in the United States. That is a huge pool of people for you to work with. And many are now using this film. And we have two purposes. It's a film to help extract families and children from public education, and it does work. We have enough information to know that it is working in that case. And it also can be used to immunize and inoculate children and families from going back into public education. Unfortunately, a lot of us do the right thing with our children, but we don't have well-defined convictions about it, and so sometimes we need to shore up our convictions. So if you look at this film as a Christian family, trust me, you'll never put your kids back there again. And it's being used to get people out as well. Let me give you, the next one is methods for using the movie. These are just some techniques that can be used with the movie. And the idea, the reason I am here speaking, I think, Jim, is that I think this is something that can be used by the Constitution Party people to help in the campaign. And if you're out there using the movie and identifying with the local homeschool groups, many of them are not going to just vote summarily for one of the two major party candidates. You might actually be able to attract and help build a new constituency for the Constitution Party. Showing it in homeschool groups and conventions. And the homeschool families are now stirred up to try to reach out and convert and extract their family and friends from public education. A lot of people started off homeschooling, it was just about me and my kids, but now the attitude is sort of changing a little bit like this, and this is sort of a strong version, but I'm not going to public school my kids, and I'm not going to let you do it either. You know, it's sort of that kind of an argument that some of us have. We have a friend in Gainesville, Georgia, who is the chairman of the board of a large Christian school, and he's a fairly well-to-do Christian businessman, and at Christmas he ordered 150 copies of this movie, IndoctriNation, and he ordered 150 copies of my book, and as a chairman of the board of the Christian school, gave it to every family in the school. Colin Gunn just concluded a tour of the West Coast. He was in Washington State and California, and he addressed some of the legislators in California. There are a few good ones there. I think there were 25 or 30 that showed up, and they showed the movie. And there's some there, even in California, fighting the good fight, trying to hold back the onslaught of evil. and gave them a complimentary copy of Indoctrination. He showed the movie at the Tampa Convention Center on March 30th and had over 500 families showed up, and it was sponsored by 20 churches in the Tampa area. So we're getting some good response, and we're getting strong responses from the movie at homeschool and Christian school conventions. We have a booth, and they flock to our table, and the word is out there in the homeschool movement, and they know it's there, and they're getting it and using it and showing it. Okay, now our last slide. And I'll be around to answer questions. I'm going to use a story from sports to kind of help you think where you might be and how we can make some sort of comeback. I love sports stories for heroism and motivation and to create a little emotional energy. But we are really in trouble. I'm not sure, I don't want to, but I'm not sure I don't agree with what Darrell Castle said last night. I fear we may be at that moment. But yet, we must fight on, and we don't know how God is going to work. And we know even if we have some sort of meltdown, that out of the ashes of a disaster, there is hope. You've seen this little brief presentation on the deplorable state of public education. Herb Titus a few years ago told me that legal education in law schools had been more thoroughly captured by the left than almost any other area of education. But there is hope. We know the story from November 14, 1970. There's a movie called We Are Marshall. I urge you to get it and see it if you have it. The Marshall University football team was in a terrible plane crash, and they lost 37 members, 8 coaches, and 25 boosters. It's the worst single plane crash in the history of any sort of athletic team. And it's as if our plane has crashed. With any sound constitutional scholars, brilliant thinkers, philosophers, theologians, historians, and bold pastors. I've been in the ministry 35 years, and I'm most disappointed by my fellow pastors and how they won't stand up and fight for this culture and fight for their own children. From the movie We Are Marshall, this scene made quite an impression on me. And it's worth getting the movie and just seeing this little moment in the movie. After they had been able to rebuild their football team, only 2 players and 1 coach were not on the plane. They rebuilt their team and staffed it with only freshman players. They had no sophomores, juniors, or seniors on the football team. And they lost almost every football game by lopsided scores. They just didn't get beat. They got beat bad. They were beaten really bad. The actor in the movie who played Coach Red Dawson said this, quote, "I can't do this anymore. Our very presence on the football field defies the main axiom of football. Winning is not anything, winning is everything." Matthew McConaughey, who played Coach Jack Lingle, said, quote, this is an important statement to get. "For us now, winning is not what counts, but simply taking the field. Taking the field." And so football remained at Marshall University. They lost more football games in the 1970s than any football program in the United States. 20 losing years. But in 1984, they had their first winning record in 20 years. This was followed by 8 conference titles, 5 straight bowl victories, and 2 national championships in the 2A division. From the ashes, they rose. You in the Constitutional Party have labored valiantly in adverse circumstances, not unlike the Marshall football team. Today, I think I have presented before you an agenda that can give you some hope of turning the tide. If our nation will survive, this is one road out of the wilderness of cultural, moral, political, and economic slavery and educational slavery. And you too can rise. However, some of you may not live to see the fortunes reverse as Marshall football team has seen, but you can at least lay a foundation for your children and grandchildren. Thanks. I hope you'll come by my table.